first run-in with Christianity happened when I was 8 years old. My uncle had just passed away, and I had to miss a day of school for the funeral. My best friend at the time felt obligated to tell me that he was in hell because he didn't believe in Jesus. As a Jew, and a young one at that, I had never heard of this place called hell before. My mother, furious, called that girl's mother, and I remember them talking on the phone for what seemed like forever. Not surprisingly, that was the end of our friendship. When it came to religion and politics in my family, the rule was don't ask, don't tell. That much made sense. I learned very quickly after that incident at 8 years old that those topics had the power to ruin friendships and start wars. I followed that rule, but not too many of my friends did, a consequence of growing up in a small suburb where everyone was white and Catholic. Anyone who was anyone attended St. Catherine's, the largest Catholic church around, and almost anything pertaining to the Jewish religion was lost on most of my classmates. You're Jewish? I remember hearing on too many occasions to count. What does that even mean? The intellectual capacity of my elementary-age self was advanced enough to explain it meant I celebrated Hanukkah and not Christmas, nothing more. Naturally, I'd be asked, so what's Hanukkah? And that's when I got stuck. In my mind at the time, Judaism was lighting candles for 8 nights in a row and getting 8 nights of presents from my parents, not Santa, or any other mythical figure. I'd simply nod when classmates responded, so it's like the Jewish Christmas, for no other reason except to end the conversation already. To add to my confusion, my first synagogue where I had my bat mitzvah was actually a church. Contrary to the stereotype, the lone Jews of my very small town did not have enough money to build a temple from scratch, so we were given permission to rent it for a while we saved up for a place of our own. The old historic church was still adorned with crosses in the stained glass windows. The basement walls were covered with crayon writings of Jesus Loves Me, since it was still its Christian daycare center and preschool. The Temple Beth Shalom sign above the door made us look like Jews for Jesus, which proved to be strangely pathetic. And this, to me, was one of many proofs of God's sense of humor. Also adding to my interfaith exposure was my role as an angel in the town Christmas pageant. And that is where I met Luke, my best friend of almost 18 years now, who is now almost done with seminary in the priesthood. And I also, through him, met his friend Anne, who left college to almost become a nun. At one point in my life, I decided I wanted to be a rabbi, so the three of us together were the priest, the nun, and the rabbi. And at one point we did go into a bar just to say we did. Luke also caught the garter at my wedding. That was interesting. Throughout my elementary education, I had to learn to be Jewish on my own terms, and I quickly realized that rituals like keeping kosher, not spending money on the Sabbath, and attending services on Friday evenings were not for me. My determination and passion were fierce, to a point where in 7th grade I was actually made fun of for being the only kid on the school bus that didn't have a cross on my forehead on Ash Wednesday. So I whipped out a highlighter and drew a sloppy Star of David on my forehead. And crosses are so simple, they're just 2 sticks. 2 triangles is really hard without a mirror. That kid never made fun of me ever again. I think I scared him, and I didn't say a word to him until high school graduation, and he still avoided me. News of that incident traveled fast, and my reputation as a super Jew started to catch on. I can't say I blamed my other Catholic friends for being slightly intimidated by me, even though I was slightly shorter than I am now, and about 80 pounds, and I was still very outspoken and made it quite clear to anyone who bothered that Jesus and I were never going to get along. I dreaded the Mondays after every weekend retreat with St. Catherine's Youth Group, because that was when practically every kid in school would show up in matching shirts with some ridiculous slogan on them. I don't know if it was a requirement to wear those shirts after every retreat, but it was really annoying when every single kid wore one. And some of the slogans, like "Stop, Drop, and Roll doesn't work in hell," were quite bad taste. So my form of revenge was to wear my own retreat shirt to school on those Mondays, which I got from a Jewish volunteer program in Washington, D.C. It had a giant, giant Star of David on the back. Most of the heroes that I had growing up were surprisingly Christian, although the heroine who influenced me the most was Joan of Arc, although admittedly I might not have found her story nearly as interesting if not for her tragic martyrdom at the stake. I still own a collection of biographies about her today, but when I was younger I started with the ones for kids with mostly pictures, so this should give you a clue about how odd I was growing up. Other kids read Babysitter's Club. I was reading about saints who were burned to death, normal stuff. Martyrdom has always intrigued me though. Is the person who chooses an agonizing death rather than renouncing their beliefs just crazy if it would be easier to deny them and live? If I were threatened to be burned alive, what would I do? I believed, I somewhat adopted the slogan WWJD, what would Joan do? Perhaps being female and closer to my age made her a lot more relatable than Jesus. Or maybe it was the idea that one need not be rich, educated, or exceptionally beautiful in order to change the world. Joan of Arc was none of those things. She only had to believe in the importance of her mission. At one point in my young life, I had a dream about her. I think I was about 9, maybe 10, and woke up convinced that I was her, reincarnated. Just don't ask me to explain how a medieval Catholic saint gets reincarnated in the body of a 20th century Jewish girl, because logic had no part. My fascination with St. Joan probably leaned more toward unhealthy obsession by the time I entered middle school. It was because of her, or rather her legend, that virginity and physical purity became something of an idol to me, a measurement of my worth as a servant of God. I was not mature enough to understand how fear of sexuality was woven into the fabric of medieval life, so much that virginity, particularly for women, was venerated to an almost magical status. The rules I set in place to guard my purity were almost identical to that of most evangelical church groups. I drew up my own purity pledge. I mean, every parent's dream, right? I drew the line at hand-holding and chaste kissing, and harshly judged my classmates who went beyond that. Forget keeping kosher or keeping the Sabbath. This was so much better. As long as I safeguarded my virginity until marriage, I was being faithful and would have no problem getting into heaven. Because, heaven is for normal people and hell was just for Hitler. By the time I was 17 years old and a senior in high school on the cusp of graduation, I was 100% certain of God's will for my life. I was going to change the world through Judaism, and I even said so in my high school yearbook, because I was that self-righteous, and that I wanted to be the first Jewish saint, even though you had to be dead to qualify. That's okay. I had completely forgotten that was even in there until I felt nostalgic and pulled the yearbook off the shelf one day. And reading those words almost brought tears to my eyes. Part of me thought, how foolish to think that I knew everything when I was barely old enough to vote. The other part of me still longs to remember what that kind of certainty feels like, and how I wish I could be certain, just as certain about who I am now as I was back then. Today, being both is more of a challenge than it was in college. I started to rethink my position on Judaism just after my father died last year, as my conversion hurt him deeply. As I watched his health rapidly deteriorate, I realized that I didn't know for sure what I believed about the afterlife anymore. I also realized that there are some things that Jews handle better than a lot of churches I've been to recently, such as grieving. The Jews, who are no strangers to suffering, don't overly theologize pain. In my experience, the Jews don't have the same pressure to reframe it in a more sanitary context, assuring the sufferer that there's a higher, holy purpose for this awful situation. Rather, they say, they just accept it for what it is. They aren't afraid to say, that really sucks. I wish more Christians would realize it's perfectly okay to say that sometimes. I wish that more Christians realized it's okay to not have answers. Today, I believe that a hallmark of spiritual identity and maturity, any kind of spirituality, is learning to be okay with the questions. I am gradually losing my fear of the S word, skepticism. Because I believe in a God who embraces our questions, no matter how difficult. I think martyrs are still fascinating figures, but they're also extremely rare. They are there to admire in my books, but I'm more than okay not living